Have you ever been in a season where everything you planned started unraveling? The job didn't last, the relationship broke, the diagnosis came back worse than expected. And suddenly, the future you pictured shattered into pieces you couldn't hold together. You pray, you cry, you try to keep faith alive, but deep down, you're scared. You ask, God, if you're in control, why does it feel like everything's out of control? Life can feel like a storm you never saw coming, waves crashing, winds howling, everything around you shifting. You're holding on to the wheel, trying to steer, but no matter what you do, the storm won't calm. And right when panic takes over, you look around and realize Jesus is still asleep in the boat. He's calm because he knows something you don't, that the storm is under his authority. The wind may be wild, but it still answers to his word. The waves may rise, but they still recognize his voice. So before you start to believe the lie that God has lost control, remember this. The storm didn't surprise him. The waves didn't catch him off guard. What feels chaotic to you is completely under his command. He hasn't lost control of the storm. He's just using it to remind you who's really steering the ship. We've all had those moments when life spins out of control, and no matter how tightly we hold on, it keeps slipping through our hands. Maybe it was a sudden phone call that changed everything. Maybe it was a diagnosis that turned your world upside down. Maybe it was the job that fell apart, the friendship that ended, the future that didn't go the way you planned. You prayed, you planned, you tried your best. And yet, everything still crumbled. And in the quiet aftermath, when the noise fades and the questions start echoing, you wonder, God, where were you in all this? Did you see what happened? Did you forget about me? The truth is, worry often creeps in when control slips away. We want to understand everything, fix everything, predict everything. But when life doesn't go according to our timeline, our hearts start to panic. We think, if I can't control this, maybe no one can. But that's when faith whispers, you never had to. Worry is what happens when we assume responsibility for things that were never ours to carry. We try to manage outcomes that belong to God. We replay every what if in our minds, as if our anxiety could rewrite his plan. But worry doesn't fix tomorrow. It only robs today of peace. Maybe you know that feeling well. You lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the bills, the future, the health report, the people you love. Your heart races, your mind spins, and you feel powerless. You don't want to doubt God, but you do. You trust him on Sundays, but by Monday, the fear is back. And that's okay. It doesn't mean your faith is broken. It means you're human. Even the strongest believers struggle with fear. Even the ones who preach faith sometimes wrestle with worry. You're not weak because you feel afraid. You're just learning how to trust in something stronger than your feelings. Maybe right now it feels like life is moving in directions you didn't choose. The people you thought would stay, walked away. The doors you prayed would open stayed shut. The prayers you've whispered for years still seem unanswered. And somewhere deep inside, you've started wondering if maybe, just maybe, God has lost control. But let me tell you something. God never loses control, not for a second, not for a heartbeat, not even when everything looks like it's falling apart. His hands are steady even when your world is shaking. His plan is unfolding even when you can't see the pattern. What feels like chaos to you is choreography to him. Sometimes God lets the pieces scatter so he can rebuild them in the right order. Sometimes he allows the storm not to sink you, but to show you that he's stronger than the waves. He's not absent in the confusion. He's authoring it for your transformation. You see, control has always been an illusion. We think we're in control when things go smoothly, but the truth is we never really were. God has always been the one holding the pen. And maybe that's what this season is revealing. Not that he's lost control, but that you never had to carry it in the first place. I know it's hard. It's hard to trust what you can't see. It's hard to believe there's order in the chaos, meaning in the waiting, purpose in the pain. It's hard to hand over the steering wheel when every part of you wants to fix it. But that's where peace begins. Not when everything makes sense, but when you finally stop trying to make sense of everything and start trusting the one who already does. We all reach that point, that breaking point, where we realize that our hands are too small to hold the world together. And that realization isn't failure. It's freedom, because the moment you let go of control is the moment God can finally show you he never lost it. Even Jesus' disciples faced that kind of fear. When the storm raged and the waves crashed into their boat, they panicked. They screamed, "Lord, don't you care that we're about to die?" And what was Jesus doing? He was asleep, not because he didn't care, but because he wasn't worried. The storm didn't wake him because the storm was never in charge. So if your life feels out of control right now, if it feels like everything's shifting under your feet, take a breath. God hasn't abandoned the boat. He's just resting because he knows something you don't. The storm you fear is still under his authority. You're not forgotten. You're not forsaken. You're not floating alone in the chaos. The same God who spoke light into darkness is still speaking peace into your storm. And maybe, just maybe, this season isn't about losing control, but about learning who's really had it all along. You're not the first to feel overwhelmed, and you're not alone. The Bible is filled with people who faced chaos, fear, and loss, but they found peace when they discovered one unshakable truth. God was in control the entire time. When life feels out of control, our hearts crave one thing: peace. But true peace isn't found in control, it's found in surrender. The Apostle Paul knew that better than anyone. Sitting in a prison cell, uncertain about his future, surrounded by guards and chains, he wrote one of the most peaceful passages in the entire Bible. "Do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. And the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus." Philippians 4:6-7. It's incredible when you think about it. Paul was in captivity, yet he wrote about calm. He had lost control of his surroundings, but he hadn't lost his confidence in God. That's because peace isn't the absence of problems, it's the presence of someone greater than them. Paul didn't have freedom, but he had perspective. He knew that as long as God was in control, the story wasn't over. Then in Romans 8:28, Paul takes it even deeper. "And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who are called according to his purpose." All things, not just the good, not just the easy, but the painful, confusing, unexpected moments too. God doesn't cause all things, but he uses all things. He weaves every thread, even the ones we wish weren't there, into a masterpiece that only makes sense when you see the full picture. That's the beauty of God's control. It's not about making life predictable, it's about making it purposeful. You may not like every chapter, but he's the author, and he knows how to turn even the hardest page into part of a greater story. And Proverbs 19:21 reminds us of this truth. "Many are the plans in a person's heart, but it is the Lord's purpose that prevails." We make plans, we draw timelines, we map out futures, and then life shifts, and suddenly we're face to face with the reality that our control was an illusion all along. But that's not something to fear. That's something to rest in. Because when our plans fall apart, his plan still stands. Think about that for a moment. We spend so much energy trying to hold everything together, our families, our finances, our futures. But God never asked us to carry that weight. He simply asked us to trust that he already is. There's a story of a young woman who was laid off from her dream job without warning. She cried for weeks, convinced that her life had collapsed. She couldn't see past the loss. But a few months later, that detour led her to start a business helping others in the same situation. Looking back, she said, "What felt like God losing control was actually God taking control. I just didn't recognize it at the time." That's what happens when you start to see your story through heaven's lens. You realize that what felt like rejection was really redirection. What felt like delay was actually divine protection. What felt like loss was preparation for something greater. Sometimes God allows what we can't control to remind us who does, because control was never His gift to us. Peace was. Paul didn't say, "You'll understand everything." He said, "You'll have peace that surpasses understanding." God's control doesn't mean you'll always understand His plan. It means you can trust Him even when you don't. You see, faith isn't pretending that everything is fine. Faith is believing that even when it's not, God is still working. And sometimes, that's the only thing that keeps you standing. The quiet assurance that the one who spoke the universe into existence still holds your life in His hands. You don't need to know how it's going to work out. You just need to know who's working it out. Because even when everything feels unstable, God's control is the constant that steadies your soul. The Bible doesn't just tell us that God is in control. It shows us what it looks like when ordinary people faced impossible situations and discovered that heaven was still in charge. Let's look at their stories, because in their storms, you'll find your strength. When we talk about God being in control, it's easy to nod along until life tests it, until the bottom drops out, until the prayer goes unanswered. That's when those words stop being theology and start becoming survival. And the Bible is filled with people who walked through chaos and discovered firsthand that God's control isn't just a comforting thought, it's a reality that changes everything. Take Joseph, for instance, a young man with dreams bigger than his brothers could stand. He didn't ask to be special, he just believed what God showed him. But before the dream ever came true, his life fell apart. Betrayed by his brothers, sold as a slave, accused of something he didn't do, forgotten in a prison cell. Year after year, his story looked nothing like the promise God had given him. If you had seen Joseph in that pit, you would have thought God must have lost control. But heaven hadn't moved an inch, because every detour was direction. Every setback was set up, every disappointment was development. God wasn't ignoring Joseph. He was positioning him. And one day, Joseph stood in Pharaoh's palace, second in command of Egypt, watching famine strike the same land that once rejected him. He could have taken revenge, but instead he said something only someone who's seen God's control could say. "You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good." What others use to hurt you, God can use to help you. That's the mystery of His control. He takes the broken pieces and builds something beautiful out of them. Then there's Moses, a man who didn't want the job God gave him, born to lead, but too afraid to believe it. God tells him to stand before Pharaoh, the most powerful man on earth, and say, "Let my people go." Moses obeys. But what happens? Pharaoh says no. The people complain. The situation gets worse. And then, when they finally escape, they find themselves trapped between the Red Sea and an army of chariots. It looked like God had brought them this far just to let them drown. Panic filled the air. Desperation took over, and Moses cried out, "God, what do I do?" And God said, "Lift your staff." That was it. Just lift it. No logic, no explanation, just faith. And when Moses lifted what he had, God did what only He could do. He split the sea in two. The people walked through on dry ground. The same waters that looked like the end became the pathway to freedom. That's what happens when you realize who's in control. God doesn't always remove the obstacle. Sometimes he turns it into your passageway. And then there's Job, the man who had everything, family, fortune, faith, and then lost it all in a single devastating season. His friends turned on him. His health failed. His prayers seemed unanswered. There were no explanations, no comfort, no end in sight. If anyone had the right to ask, "God, where are you?" it was Job. But even in his suffering, Job said something profound. "Though he slay me, yet will I trust him." That's not blind faith, that's anchored faith. The kind of faith that doesn't depend on outcomes, but on the unshakable truth of who God is. Job didn't understand what God was doing, but he never stopped believing that God was still in charge. And when the storm finally passed, Job's story didn't just return to normal. It became a testimony. God restored double what was lost. But more importantly, Job said, "Before I had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you." Sometimes God's control doesn't mean you'll get everything back the way it was. It means you'll come out of it knowing him in a way you never did before. And finally, we come to a story that still speaks to every believer who's ever felt overwhelmed, the story of Jesus and the storm. The disciples had seen miracles. They'd watched Jesus heal the sick, feed thousands, raise the dead. But one night, while crossing the sea, a violent storm hit. The waves crashed over the boat and panic spread among them. These were seasoned fishermen, men who knew storms. But this one was different. They were terrified. And Jesus? He was asleep in the middle of chaos. That's when fear took over and they shouted, "Lord, don't you care that we're perishing?" If you've ever prayed that prayer, "God, don't you care?" you're in good company. The disciples asked the same question. But then Jesus got up, rebuked the wind, and said to the waves, "Peace, be still." And just like that, the storm obeyed. The winds stopped. The sea calmed. But Jesus didn't just calm the storm, he confronted their fear. He asked, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" In other words, did you really think this storm was stronger than me? You see, the same Jesus who slept through the storm also stood over it. His rest wasn't indifference, it was confidence. He knew something they didn't, that every wave, every gust of wind, every drop of rain still answered to his voice. And that's what this whole message comes down to. When life feels out of control, remember that the wind and the waves still recognize their maker. Joseph teaches us that delay doesn't destroy destiny. Moses reminds us that when there's no way, God makes one. Job shows us that even pain has purpose when placed in God's hands. And Jesus reveals that peace isn't found in the absence of storms, but in the presence of the Savior. Each of their stories paints the same truth from a different angle. God was never out of control. Not in the pit, not at the sea, not in the ashes, not in the storm. And that means he's not out of control in your situation either. He's not pacing heaven, wondering how to fix what you're facing. He's already written the ending. You may not see it yet, but he's working in ways you can't imagine, arranging details, redirecting paths, preparing hearts, aligning moments. What looked like a setback for Joseph was the setup for salvation. What looked like an ending for Moses was the entrance into freedom. What looked like loss for Job was the beginning of revelation. What looked like death on the sea was proof that even the storm has limits. So the next time life feels like it's falling apart, remember, it's still falling into place. The same God who parted seas, restored lives, and silenced storms hasn't changed. He's not nervous. He's not uncertain. He's not late. He's still in control. If they could trust God through betrayal, disaster, and storms, then so can we. Because the same hands that held them steady are still holding you today. Maybe the reason God allows storms is because calm seas never teach us who's really steering. Maybe the reason the plan broke is because His was better all along. Maybe control isn't something we lose. It's something we were never meant to carry in the first place. What if the chaos you're in is actually the canvas for God's next miracle? What if the delay isn't denial, but divine direction? What if what feels like an ending is just heaven rearranging the beginning? We ask, God, where are you? And heaven whispers back, right here, where I've always been. We think He's distant when we can't see His hand, but maybe that's when He's closest, because He's teaching us to walk by faith, not by sight. When your plans fall apart, it's not because God dropped the pieces. It's because He's rebuilding something better with them. When the door closes, it's not rejection, it's redirection. When the storm rages, it's not punishment, it's preparation. You see, faith doesn't mean you'll never feel fear. It means you've learned where to place it. You hand it to the one who holds the world together, because the same voice that calmed the sea still speaks peace to your soul. So before you panic, pause. Before you assume the worst, remember the truth. Before you start to think God's lost control, look back. Hasn't He been faithful before? When the Israelites stood before the Red Sea, they saw no way out. God saw a highway under the water. When Joseph was in the pit, his brothers saw rejection. God saw promotion. When Job was on the ashes, his friends saw judgment. God saw transformation. When Jesus was on the cross, the world saw defeat. God saw redemption. He's always writing stories that the world doesn't understand, because He's not bound by time, by reason, or by human logic. He doesn't need calm conditions to prove He's in control. He walks on waves. He speaks in storms. He moves in ways that don't make sense until they do. So maybe you're standing in front of something that looks impossible, a problem that's too big, a pain that's too deep, a path that's too unclear. Maybe your heart is screaming, God, are you still in control? And maybe today His answer is simple. Yes, I never stopped being. When your hands are shaking, His are steady. When your strength runs out, His has just begun. When you can't see the way, He's already gone ahead and cleared it. You don't need to understand everything to trust the one who does. You don't need to control the outcome when you know who controls the universe. So lift your eyes. Look past the chaos. Remember the character of your God. He's never been surprised. He's never been defeated. He's never been unseated. The storm may roar, but heaven is still calm. Your plans may change, but His purpose never will. You may be walking through uncertainty, but you're walking with the one who commands certainty itself. And maybe that's what peace really is. Not the absence of problems, but the awareness of presence. Because when you finally realize that God is in control of everything, you stop trying to play God, and you start resting like a child. But this truth isn't just something to know, it's something to live. So how do we actually walk in peace when everything feels uncertain? Let's talk about what to do while you wait for God's control to reveal itself. So what do you do when life feels like it's spinning faster than your faith can catch up? When your heart knows God is in control, but your mind keeps trying to take the wheel back? How do you live this truth? Not just quote it, not just sing it, but breathe it, walk it, trust it. When everything around you feels uncertain, the first thing you do is pray. Not the kind of prayer that's polished and rehearsed, but the kind that's raw and real. The kind where you stop pretending you're okay and pour out what's actually inside. Because prayer isn't about giving God information, it's about giving Him invitation. It's saying, God, I don't understand this, but I'm giving you space to work in it. Sometimes peace doesn't come from fixing the situation. It comes from finally admitting you can't. And once you've prayed, you learn to worship, not after the breakthrough, but before it. Worship isn't a reaction, It's a declaration. It's standing in the middle of the storm and saying, God, you're still good. It's the most defiant act of faith you can make. When you praise Him through the pain loses power over you. Because worship doesn't just remind you of who God is, it reminds your worry who's boss. Then you start looking back, not at the mistakes, but at the memories of His faithfulness. Remember the doors He opened that you didn't knock on. Remember the storms He calmed that you thought would drown you. Remember the times He came through when you thought it was over. Reflection builds resilience. Every time you look back and see His fingerprints on your past, it strengthens your faith for the future. And while you remember, you obey, even in the ordinary. Because sometimes the greatest acts of faith don't look like miracles, they look like consistency. Keep praying, keep serving, keep forgiving, keep showing up. Don't let what you can't control stop you from doing what you can. God blesses obedience in the everyday, and it's often in those ordinary moments that extraordinary peace begins to grow. Then there's the hardest part, letting go. The moment you finally unclench your fists and say, God, I trust you with what I can't control. Letting go doesn't mean you stop caring. It means you stop carrying what isn't yours. It's realizing that control is a weight that was never meant to fit in human hands. The more you release, the lighter you become. Because peace isn't found in holding on. It's found in handing over. But even as you let go, don't forget to rest. Rest is not laziness. It's faith in motion. It's saying, God, I can sleep because you don't. When you rest, you're declaring that the world doesn't depend on your strength, it depends on His sovereignty. Sometimes your greatest act of worship is taking a breath and refusing to panic. And maybe one last thing, surround yourself with people whose faith speaks louder than your fear. Find those who remind you that God is still working when you can't see it. Isolation breeds anxiety, but community builds courage. When your faith is flickering, stand near someone whose faith is burning and let their flame light yours again. These are the quiet disciplines that teach your soul to stop fighting for control and start trusting the one who's never lost it. They don't change your circumstances overnight, but they change you in the middle of them. You see, trusting God's control isn't a one-time decision. It's a daily surrender. Every morning you wake up and choose to believe that God's hand is still steady. Every night you go to sleep trusting that even in the dark, He's still working. And slowly you begin to notice the anxiety that once consumed you starts to loosen its grip. The panic begins to fade. The questions don't stop coming, but the peace starts staying longer. Because you've learned something that can't be shaken. Control doesn't belong to you, but peace does. And when peace starts to grow, it changes everything. You stop rushing ahead, trying to force doors open. You stop overthinking what's next and start trusting who's next to you. You start living lighter. Not because life got easier, but because you finally realized who's in charge. So when life gets uncertain again, and it will, go back to these truths. Pray, worship, remember, obey, let go, rest, and stay surrounded. Every one of those choices is a quiet rebellion against worry. Every one is a declaration that says, God, I don't have to control this, because you already do. And when you live that way, not trying to fix every storm, but trusting the one who calms them, you'll find something deeper than control. You'll find peace. Because at the end of the day, peace doesn't come from knowing the plan. It comes from knowing the planner. Maybe right now, as you hear these words, you're standing in the middle of something you don't understand. The waiting is long, the diagnosis is uncertain, the relationship is fragile, the dream is fading. You've prayed and believed, and still life doesn't look like what you pictured. And you've started to wonder, maybe not out loud, but deep down in your heart, God, are you really in control? You're tired, you're scared, You're human, but the truth still stands like a lighthouse in the storm. God has not lost control, not of the world, not of your future, not of your story. You see, control isn't something God tries to maintain. It's something He is. His sovereignty doesn't waver when life does. His plans don't crumble when yours do. He's not shaken by bad news. He's not intimidated by time. He's not waiting for the world to calm down so He can start working. He's already working. In the waiting, in the breaking, in the quiet places where you can't see Him yet. You may not understand what's happening, but understanding was never a requirement for peace. Trust is. Peace doesn't come from having answers. It comes from having assurance. And your assurance is this: the same God who spoke galaxies into motion is still speaking purpose into your chaos. When you can't see His hand, you can trust His heart. When you can't trace the plan, you can trust His promise. When you don't know what's next, you can rest in the one who already does. You may not control the outcome, but you can control your focus. Stop staring at the storm. Start looking at the Savior. Stop obsessing over the what-ifs. Start remembering the God-dids. Because He has never once failed to keep a promise, and He's not about to start now. Maybe your life feels scattered, unpredictable, and fragile. But even shattered glass can reflect light. Even chaos can become creation when placed in the hands of the Creator. God doesn't need perfection to work. He just needs permission. When you surrender control, you're not giving up. You're giving in to something greater. So let this be your declaration tonight. I'm done fighting for control. I'm done trying to fix what faith was meant to trust. I may not understand this moment, but I believe God is in it. I choose peace over panic. I choose surrender over striving. I choose faith over fear. Because every time you choose faith, heaven moves. Every time you choose trust, anxiety loses. Every time you say, God, I know you've got this, you're stepping into the same peace Jesus spoke over the waves. And here's the beautiful thing. Even when your faith feels small, God's control isn't. The strength of your faith doesn't determine His ability. His ability sustains your faith. The same God who kept Joseph in the prison, Moses at the sea, Job in the ashes, and Jesus through the storm is the same God who's holding you right now. You may be waiting, but you are not forgotten. You may feel hidden, but you are not abandoned. You may be delayed, but you are still destined. He's still writing, still weaving, still working, still reigning. Your story is not falling apart. It's falling into place. So lift your head. Breathe again. Let your heart rest. You don't have to understand the plan to trust the planner. You don't have to feel in control to live in peace. The God who controls the stars hasn't lost sight of you. The same voice that told the ocean, "This far and no further," is speaking over your life right now. Peace. Be still. So here's your challenge. When the fear comes, speak faith. When worry whispers, worship louder. When you're tempted to take back control, open your hands and say, God, I trust you. Because when you finally stop trying to control everything, you'll discover that the peace you've been chasing was waiting in surrender all along. You were never meant to carry the weight of control, only the confidence of faith. And when faith takes the lead, fear loses its power. So tonight, let go. Not because life makes sense, but because God is still on the throne. Let go not because you're weak, but because He is strong. Let go not because you've given up, but because you're finally giving in to the one who's never once failed to hold the universe together. Remember His promise in Isaiah 41:10. Do not fear, for I am with you. Do not be dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you and help you. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand. The same hand that holds the galaxies holds you. The same God who commands the sun to rise is commanding your heart to rest. And maybe, just maybe, that's what true faith looks like. not trying to take control, but daring to rest in the fact that you never had to. So, breathe. Exhale the worry. Inhale his peace. And remember, the storm isn't in control. The enemy isn't in control. The fear isn't in control. God is, always has been, always will be.